there you go.
People out of them.
Thank you. Let me start by talking about what has been on my mind over the last few months, especially since the massacre in Bondi, huge. Needless to say, shooting attack that targeted a large group of Jews celebrating Hanukkah in the Sydney Park, killing 15 people and injuring more than 40, was tragedy that should be condemned. And of course, I do not support any form of violence committed by Hamas or any other group or individual. I would also like to express my deepest sympathies to the victims, their families, and their friends. However, I was angered, and I'm still angry. I was angered by the fact that the Jewish community, most politicians from both the Labour and Liberal parties, and most media outlets, with very few exceptions, including the Progressive Jewish Council of Australia, attributed solely to anti-Semitism and focused solely on holding the Australian government accountable for its delayed response. They paid little attention to the fact that more than 73,000 people have been killed in Gaza so far, many of whom were women and children. You may remember that during the shortly after the Bondi massacre, the reporting on the Gaza is completely stopped. No one heard about what's going on in Gaza. It's really astonishing. Prime Minister Albanese then sought to appease the Jewish community by inviting Israeli President Isaac Herzog to Australia, quote, to honor and remember the victims of the anti-Semitic terrorist attack in Bondi, and unquote, and show his support for Jewish Australians and the Australian Jewish community at this time. However, Herzog fully endorsed Netanyahu's genocidal attack on Gaza, claiming that there are, quote and unquote, no uninvolved civilians in Gaza, and therefore the entire Gaza population should be punished. In December 2023, Herzog was pictured signing a bomb due to be dropped on Gaza. Although he could be prosecuted as a war criminal, the head of state, especially the symbolic head of state, is immune from indictment. Now, Prime Minister Albanese was one of the first world leaders to publicly endorse the US-Israeli military action against Iran, saying, quote, we support the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent Iran continuing to threaten international peace and security, unquote, despite the fact that the attack was preemptive in the middle of the diplomatic negotiations, and clearly violates international law and the UN Charter. This time, Albanese completely ignored the fact that one of the initial strikes in the US-Israeli attack on Iran hit a girls' school in Ninab in southern Iran, killing at least 175 people, most of whom were primary school girls. Probably you know that now they use AI targeting, the military target, attack the military target. The AI makes mistakes because AI, totally depends on the information provided by human beings. Since the early 20th century, we have experienced a series of major wars. These include the First and Second World Wars, Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, the Kosovo War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to name a few. Tens of millions of people have fallen victim to the numerous war atrocities committed in these conflicts, resulting from immoral decisions made by those in power, such as politicians and military leaders. Yet they always exploited a moral reason for going to war. For example, during World War II, the US claimed it was to protect freedom and democracy, while Japan said it was to liberate Asian nations from Western imperialism. But both the Americans killed large number of the Germans, Italians, and Japanese by bombing, firebombing, and acrid bombing, and the Japanese killed tens of millions of millions of people in Asia, and including POWs, because they conducted the war 15 years, very long time. Now, interestingly, recently, Omar El-Alakat, an Egyptian, Canadian, American author and journalist currently living in the US, has written a very interesting book called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. In this book, he stated the following: the moral component of history, the most necessary component, is simply a single question asked over and over again when it's mattered. Who sided with justice and who sided with power? Another interesting book that I recently read, Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal, written by a Palestinian writer and poet, Muhammad al-Kurd. He said, a universality that recognizes the Palestinian condition is the human condition. Palestine is a microcosm of the world, wretched, raging, fraught, and fragmented, on fire, stubborn, ineligible, and dignified. The lens we lend the Palestinian reveals how we see each other and how we see everything else. And that is why Palestine is the moral issue of the world. Now, regarding the moral issue, the second and the third paragraphs of the preamble to the Japanese Constitution, which was promulgated in 1947, 2 years after the Asia-Pacific War, clearly emphasized the importance of the morality for justice and peace because of the Japanese dreadful wartime conduct. Here, this preamble says, we, the Japanese people, desire peace for all time and are deeply conscious of the high ideals controlling human relationship, and we have determined to preserve our security and existence, trusting in the justice and faith of the peace-loving people of the world. We desire to occupy an honorable place in an international society striving for preservation of peace and the banishment of tyranny and slavery, oppression, and intolerance for all time from the earth. We recognize that all people of the world have the right to live in peace, free from fear and want. We believe that no nation is responsible to itself alone, but that laws of political morality are universal, and that obedience to such laws is incumbent upon all nations who would sustain their own sovereignty and justify their sovereign relationship with other nations. Yet, the majority of Japanese people now, particularly politicians from the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, including Prime Minister and all cabinet members, are ignoring the content of the preamble entirely. Led by Sanae Takaichi, the country's first female Prime Minister, the Japanese government is now planning to amend the constitution by deleting the entire preamble and reverting to a version similar to that in place before the war. This would involve abandoning Article 9, which renounces war and prohibits the maintenance of any war potential. Her thinking is anachronistic, delusional, and completely devoid of morality. She has consistently refused to accept Japan's responsibility for the numerous atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese imperial forces against millions of Asian individuals and allied POWs of war, including sexual violence against women, such as the infamous comfort woman system. Neither Israel, the United States, nor Russia are using moral justification to launch preemptive strikes against the other nations and slaughter countless civilians anymore. How can we address the lack of political morality around the world? Interestingly, the renowned Canadian doctor and author Gabo Mate, who survived the Holocaust as a child, became a Zionist when he grew up. However, he realized in the 1960s, when he was a student, that collective Jewish trauma was causing the Zionists to dehumanize themselves and inflict violence on Palestinians. This experience completely changed him, turning him into a staunch anti-Zionist. He became an expert in the effect of trauma, including the long-term effects on physical and mental health. In July 2014, Mate wrote an article called "Beautiful Dream of Israel Has Become a Nightmare." And in this article, he said that Israel's actions were not incompatible with achieving a just peace. He compared Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto under the Nazis because of the significant power balance between occupier and occupied. In November 2023, he told broadcaster Pally Morgan that he had cried every day for 2 weeks following his visit to the occupied territories during the first Intifada, which began on 9 December 1987. He said that the occupation and the persecution of Palestinians should stop, and that the land occupied since 1967 should be returned. I don't know whether you will know that he was here in Melbourne last year giving a talk. He was invited by the very progressive Jewish organization I mentioned about the Jewish Council of Australia. It's a small Jewish organization, but they invited him. So he gave a talk in Sydney, and a marvelous talk. Here we see how a person can regain their humanity by empathizing with the suffering experienced by victims of atrocities inflicted by their own people. In this way, people are able to share the victims' pain. There are certain similarities between Holocaust survivors and the Japanese atomic bomb survivors. Due to their tremendous and indescribable sufferings, airborne survivors also have a collective trauma. They tend to see themselves only as victims of war and cannot imagine taking responsibility for the atrocities committed by the Japanese imperial forces during the Asia-Pacific War. This trauma has also influenced the general Japanese population's perception of themselves as victims of war, as well as their lack of collective sense of responsibility for the aggressive war their ancestors waged. Making matter even worse, the Japanese government is exploiting the collective trauma experienced by atomic bomb survivors for political gain in order to portray the Japanese nation as victims of war. This enabled them to evade responsibility for their numerous war crimes by denying the suffering of countless Asian victims and former POWs. To this end, the Japanese government frequently employs the phrase, quote unquote, Japan is the only nation in the world to have suffered a nuclear attack. At the same time, however, it fully supports the US strategy of nuclear deterrence and is reluctant to call on nuclear-armed nations to abolish or reduce their nuclear weapons. These immoral policies clearly violate the preamble of Japan's constitution. Although very few, however, we can find a similar person like Dr. Gabo Mate among the Japanese airborne survivors who clearly acknowledged her responsibility as a Japanese citizen for Japan's wartime atrocities. The late Suzuko Numata was one of such a person. Suzuko lost her left leg in the atomic bombing and experienced profound psychological trauma as a result. She gradually experienced a restoration of her humanity by helping other physically disabled people through her work and activities. In 1981, at the age of 58, she suddenly realized how important it was to share her experiences as an atomic bomb survivor. So often that the survivors, Holocaust survivors, atomic bomb survivors, when they become older, they suddenly change their mind. Before that, they've said it's too traumatic to talk about. But something clicks, and then suddenly, not many people, but quite a few people actually come forward and started talking about it. And Suzuko was one of them. Initially, her testimony focused solely on conveying the horror of her own suffering. However, from the mid-1980s onward, her encounters with Korean atomic bomb survivors and survivors of the Battle of Okinawa made her recognize the similarities between her experience and their experiences. She realized that